Hi, everyone. Welcome in. I'm going to give folks another couple minutes to Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining me. We're going to go ahead and get started. Sorry. I had some technical difficulties here in the beginning, but this is our regular Zoom live now. So Terry, I see in the chat that you weren't getting audio. Are you able to hear me now? Awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone. Again, feel free to use the chat. I can see it, and I'll be monitoring it. If you have any questions or you'd like to have any comments or anything like that, please let me know. But thank you so much for joining me today for this session. This is going to be sort of a session where I talk about one of the models for family engagement and advocacy that IDRA was able to develop, called the Family Advocates for Young English Learners program. And so I'll be talking about our model for authentic family and community engagement and advocacy. Thank you. So a little bit about me. My name is Araceli García. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm an IDRA Education Policy Fellow, and my areas of focus were immigrant students and emergent bilingual students, also known as English learner students. I graduated from Stanford in the class of 2020 with a BA in Chicanas and Latinx Studies and an education minor. So getting into family engagement and advocacy. So you'll see there that we have FAYEL/Bambi. So FAYEL is the acronym for Family Advocates for Young English Learners, and Bambi is the same acronym but in Spanish. So Familias Abogando por Niños Bilingües. So a little bit about this program. It was launched sort of in conjunction with the Early Childhood English Learner Initiative, and you can find more information about that at bilingualtexas.org, and I'm putting that link in the chat. And so what this initiative did was essentially set out a roadmap for where we want to see Texas take bilingual education over the course of the future. So we really wanted to have families engaged as a part of that, and that's why IDRA came onto the initiative and proposed that we have families be a key part and a key stakeholder in thinking about what that looks like, and also in moving some of these recommendations to pieces of legislation and getting them passed through the state legislature here in Texas. So the stages of the FAYEL program development were first and foremost to connect with community-based organizations that serve families of emergent bilingual students. So IDRA has had long-standing relationships with an organization called Arise in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And that organization is a more direct services organization. They work directly with families, and they work on a lot of leadership initiatives with families. But the work that we were doing was really taking those family advocates who were already engaged sort of in their school level, but we wanted to really elevate their level of advocacy to the state level so that they had experience actually advocating at the Capitol, not just on behalf of their own students or at their own school, but on behalf of all students. The next step was really for us to listen and to learn from each other. So we would tailor workshops, trainings, and learning sessions to meet the community's needs, not what we wanted to teach them, but first and foremost, hearing from them about what they even felt the issues were affecting their students. And then based on what they were telling us, which we were surprised to hear in some of our learning sessions, that many of the families that we talked to were actually very concerned about mental health. And so I myself, I'm from a community that's full of like low-income families of color. And when I was growing up, I feel like mental health was not, even though it's not that long ago, mental health was not very much discussed in my own family or in the community broadly. So I was a little bit surprised, pleasantly surprised to hear many of the families that we were working with be so concerned about the effects of the pandemic, not just on their children's schooling, but on their children's mental health and well-being. And so we were able to hear from families, and some of the other education policy fellows were able to work on more legislation that had to do with providing mental health supports in order to support what the families were saying was important to them. They also wanted to really understand what the legislature does, how the state legislature impacts their students and their ability to have access to an equitable and excellent education, and what they could do to impact the legislative process. So they did not simply want to receive a phone banking script and make the call, read the script. They wanted to really understand who they were calling, why they were calling, understand the laws, the data, understand the process. And so we were really wanting to have them be engaged in that way as well. We didn't want to tokenize family engagement in our work. We wanted to make sure we were scaffolding their learning. And it's a lot of work. We did all those workshops bilingually in Spanish and English to meet the needs of our families. Finally, we had advocacy action. So once the legislature started and there started to be hearings on bills that were set forth by the Early Childhood English Learner Initiative, we were able to facilitate ways for families to advocate for equitable education opportunities for their students. And we did this in large part by hosting several town halls, community roundtables, meetings. We had a bilingual education advocacy night before a bill was set to be heard. And we were able to do that over Zoom. So right now I'll get into a little bit of the challenges and successes of the program and what we are taking moving forward. And then I'd love to hear a little bit from you all if you have any questions about how we can continue to grow this model out. So a lot of our families were able to submit public comments on many bills, even those not related directly to bilingual education. For example, bills relating to digital equity, because that was also very important to our families. And they were also able to actually make phone calls to legislative offices at the Capitol and let folks know when they met staffers that they cared about and wanted to see the bills that we had advanced pass. Some of the program challenges. So obviously, the legislative process in general, and especially in Texas, I would argue is intentionally opaque. And that was in many ways exacerbated by the pandemic and having everything virtual. We couldn't just drive down to the Capitol with everybody and make office visits in person like one might normally do under different circumstances. So we were explaining all of these things and trying to do our best to say, technically, this is how something should happen, but there's this whole other behind the scenes work that we have to make sure that we're watching out for. So those kinds of processes are very intentionally opaque, and we know that they're meant to keep out certain folks, including the kind of people that IDRA hopes to serve. Another program challenge was language barriers. And so the way that this came up very tangibly, many of our advocates in the Bambi and FAYEL program were Spanish speakers, and they would call the Capitol and they would let me know that they were hung up on, or that the legislative staffer said like, no hablo español, and hung up on them, or would say, you know, they seemed to not really understand what I was saying and just quickly tried to like get me off the phone. So it was like not very, those are all experiences that really deter someone from wanting to continue to engage in the legislative process, right? And I can say personally that many people who I know are actually citizens, and though this shouldn't matter, it is their right as citizens to be able to be a part of the democratic process, which is exactly what they were trying to do and making phone calls to their representatives, and were actually blocked because these representatives' office didn't have someone who was equipped to be able to meet the needs of their community. Obviously, as you can see, and even in this setting, we are navigating this new virtual world. And so this was a challenge, not just for IDRA and how we had to change how we normally do family engagement. It was also a challenge for many of our families. And I can say from personal experience that many other people in my life have trouble with technology. And obviously, we know that that trouble is structural as well. There's a reason why some people are digitally literate and some reasons why some other people are not digitally literate. And so part of our work also in Bambi and empowering our families to really embrace this new virtual world was also sometimes we had to do some digital literacy training. Sometimes they did some literacy training for us, telling us that really we needed to make sure that all of our meetings are being streamed on Facebook because that's where they had the most engagement. And so all of our challenges and successes really were happening together. In working with our families, we were really able to learn from them as much as they tell us that they learned from us. Obviously, as you can imagine, we've come up against racism and apathy. And I sort of link the two because I think that apathy also stems from racism. Though emergent bilingual students account for 1 in 5 of all Texas students, and that number gets even smaller as we get into the early childhood grades. It's over 1 million students in Texas, and yet legislators never seem to talk about that or care about that or want to make any meaningful investments in that. And so pushing for a community that has been ignored, and that they've been ignored because of racism and they don't want to hear from families, all of that leads to some program challenges in trying to make sure that the voices of these women are heard, and that the voices of our students who are emergent bilingual students are heard. Long-term engagement. So some of you may know that in the legislative session in Texas, the legislature only convenes once every 2 years. So that means, like many other states who convene every year, it can be a little bit more difficult to encourage families to remain engaged over the span of 2 years. It's very different during a legislative session. But we also wanted to make sure that everything that the families who were engaged in our program were learning, the skills that they were learning and building, were transferable. And so that's how we sort of encouraged our families to think about it. And we also want our families to be engaged in the interim of sessions, doing the implementation work for some of the bills that I will mention to you all in a second. We also wanted to reject tokenism, and I'm so glad that I was able to tune in to some of the last part of Dr. Gorski's presentation about celebrating diversity and things like that, and sort of detours that can make us feel good without actually having done any structural work to really make sure that our families were engaged, or really deal with even the ways that our families can feel excluded, even as like a well-intentioned nonprofit organization, ensuring that we are rejecting tokenism and that we're not just accepting 4 or 5 women who are saying, you know, now we've had family engagement. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're growing that out. We worked with emergent bilingual students, meaning students who are learning English as a second language in Texas, but we primarily worked with people who are bilingual in Spanish and English. And that's a reflection in part of who is on our staff, because that's the languages that I am fluent in, but it's also an indication to us that we need to make sure that we are working even harder to make sure that we're reaching the families who speak Vietnamese, the families who speak Urdu, the families who speak Arabic, and as best we can, trying to meet their needs and ensure that they're also a part of this process. On to the fun part, some of the successes of this program. So increased understanding, of course. I always say that this is half the work, right? Half the battle is just making folks aware of what is happening, and that knowledge really is power. It sounds very corny, but that's the truth. And so now that these families have learned what the legislative session is, have learned that the power of their phone calls actually leads to results, no one can take that away from them, and they're going to be prepared. And so the other piece of this was language pride. And so you all heard me talk about the example of the bilingual advocacy night when we had families who were calling. And instead of being discouraged or let down by the fact that many of these offices simply hung up on them when they started speaking in Spanish, many of them felt that this was another issue that they wanted to pursue. And it only solidified for them the importance of bilingualism, the importance of making sure that their students and children had access to being bilingual, because they said, my student needs to be working on one of these offices to make sure that when other people call, that they're able to actually hear what they have to say and listen to them. And we're all better served when we have people who are well prepared to be in those positions. And so they took pride in their language, took pride in their culture, and like were really able to solidify for themselves why this was concretely just so important. New virtual world. So this was as much a program challenge as a program success. And it was helpful in many ways because, as many of you know, many things in the legislature were actually virtual this year. So public comments were not normally allowed on the House side. And then because of COVID, they opened that up as a portal for people to be able to opine. So where families might not before had been able to make the 4, 5, 6 hour drive from wherever they are in Texas all the way to the Capitol, now they were able to participate in virtual ways. And they were also able to participate with IDRA virtually. And many times it's a lot easier, it's a lot less time to ask. Many of these people were mothers who also worked, who had kids to pick up from school, who had dinner to make from our 6:30 to 7:30 meeting. Some of them were eating dinner. And so those are the kinds of sort of positive sides, the silver linings to this new virtual setting, and something that we don't want to lose. We don't want to lose that extra access that we were able to gain through public comments on the House side. That's huge. And I think that we would be better served if that would be something that continues. Anti-racist power building. So many of us were rightfully concerned about all of these whitewashing of history bills, classroom censorship bills, and what it takes to defeat that, in my mind, is families and students and teachers organized to be able to combat that. If you look at who is pushing for these sorts of legislation, the legislators are pulling on these really organized groups of parents, right? They're aggressive. They show up at city council meetings with signs. It seems like they've been prepped, right? And so our side has to be just as organized, just as prepped, just as ready. And this is how we do that work, right? So these are families who were organized around the issue of bilingual education and equitable bilingual education for their students. But of course, they understand after they've been through our processes and because of their own life experiences that lack of access to an equitable education stems from racism. And they understand quickly the kind of parents who will show up at the school and demand that teachers stop teaching the truth in classrooms and why they would do such a thing. And so they are ready to be activated. This is an active network that's ready to be activated in all these other sorts of spheres as well, right? And so part of our job is to make sure that we are building up the people power necessary to combat these bills locally. All of this entails leadership development and transferable skills. That's exactly what all of this is going into. Now that IDRA has worked with this group of women, they themselves told us, because we wanted to know, what do you all think? What are the next steps for you all? Now that the legislature has ended and we've had some success with some of these bills, where do you see yourself continuing this work? And many of them said, I feel an obligation to continue educating other people, my friends, my family members, the parents of my kids' friends, right? So they are now the leaders in their community, and that's the ultimate goal. I think if they could organize me out of a job, that's the dream, because that's who needs to be in the forefront. That's who needs to be educating their peers, as always. And so we are really excited about the possibilities for what really is a domino effect. We're able to create leaders who in turn are able to facilitate these trainings and informal conversations amongst the people that they know to make sure that they have an increased understanding and that they become part of an active coalition against anti-racist, against these anti-racism bills, right? And so all of those are transferable skills, and we can see that in action. And I think that during such a tough legislative session in Texas, that's what kept us going, seeing our families be so engaged. Many people point to young students, students who are really leading the charge and so ready to change and mold to a new world. But I never want to leave older folks, parents, families behind, because they are so ready as well. We just have to make sure that we're taking the time. And it's hard work to ensure that families don't feel left behind in those changes. But it's also always worth it, and the rewards pay off so much greater when our students and families and advocates and teachers are all in line to fight for equitable education for our students. Continuing on the sort of successes of this program, these are 4 major pieces of legislation that were passed here in Texas. So it's hard to believe that during the same session, when many other controversial and really difficult bills were passed out of the legislature, that these 4 bills were also passed. So these were the bills that when our families were calling, when we were giving our trainings on bilingual education in the legislature, these were the bills that we were introducing to our families, getting their feedback on, and having them push for at the legislature and amongst their own community. So our keystone, these are also the pieces of legislation that came out of the recommendations of that early childhood English learner agenda. So the first is a state strategic plan for bilingual education. It may come as a surprise to some of you, or it may not be surprising to some of you, that though Texas educates the highest proportion of emergent bilingual students, there is no meaningful or concrete plan with any goals for ensuring access to a high quality bilingual education for students in Texas up until now. And so all of these bills will take effect September 1st, but this essentially mandates that the Texas Education Agency work with key stakeholders to set up a strategic plan for ensuring access to high quality bilingual education for all students in Texas. And this includes setting meaningful and tangible benchmarks around increasing the number of certified bilingual educators, which we know has been just a chronic shortage forever. We also want to set goals for how many high-quality dual language immersion programs are available to students, which could be a whole nother presentation. Many people ask about what IDRA feels is the best sort of dual language program setup and things like that. But we know that dual language immersion really is one of the best options for how students can not just learn English, but maintain both languages and graduate bilingual and biliterate. And so that's the goal that IDRA pushes for and that this statewide strategic plan pushes for. The next bill actually creates a new bilingual special education certification here in Texas. And so this came about earlier in the Early Childhood English Learner Initiative when we were talking to families, we were talking to teachers, we were talking to students and school leaders about what was missing in bilingual education. And many of them responded that students who were at the intersection of learning English in school and a developmental or learning disability were often falling through the cracks because there was no system dedicated to making sure that they were not just getting a compounding of services, but really services that are designed to meet those specific needs. Normally the way it works, and many of you probably are also familiar with this, but it's sort of up to the bilingual education teacher and the special education teacher to just coordinate as best they can. And that works really great in some districts and not so great in most districts, right? So this new bilingual special education certification essentially prepares teachers to teach in 3 different kinds of classrooms: a special education classroom, a bilingual education classroom, or students who have both of those needs present. So we are very excited about this new certification, and we hope that educators who are passionate about meeting the needs of those students will take that path. SB 2081 really seems simple, and it may not even seem directly related to bilingual education, but it establishes smaller pre-K class sizes. There is no cap on pre-K, or was no cap on pre-K sizes in Texas before, and now the cap will be 11 students to 1 teacher with a maximum of 22 students in a classroom that has a teacher and a teacher's aide. This is huge for bilingual education because in Texas, students who don't speak English when they're starting school actually qualify for free pre-K. And so a vast majority of students who are in these pre-K programs are emergent bilingual students. And so we want to make sure that since pre-K is setting them up for their foundation of education, we want to make sure that it's a strong foundation, that the teacher has enough time to make sure that they're meeting the needs of emergent bilingual students in pre-K. And finally, SB 2066 transitions our entire state from using negative terms, deficit terms, such as limited English proficient, LEP, or English learner or English language learner, which are English-centric, and transitions us to the asset-based term emergent bilingual student. This is really important for us, and though it is mostly symbolic, we also want to make sure that on the implementation side, we're engaging the families in each of these 4 bills, right? So they are the SB 560 strategic plan. Families and community members are noted as key stakeholders that must be discussed, that must be engaged in the process of creating the strategic plan. And we've actually already had several of our Bambi FAYEL participants actually participate in focus groups with the Texas Education Agency that were set up exactly to do that. They wanted to know from families, how can we engage more families like you? What do we need to do better? And thank you, Sam, for plugging the testimony and work that we did at IDRA to really usher in this new term. Though it's symbolic, we are also working with TEA on a statewide campaign to ensure that it doesn't just become a change in paperwork, right? That would be the most tragic thing for us. We want to make sure that it really begins a shift in the state of Texas and hopefully in the nation in what we think when we think English learner, we don't want to think someone who doesn't speak English yet. We want to think of someone who has a unique potential for bilingualism and biliteracy, and a unique potential to serve not just as many times we would speak to our families, and they were able to reorient this for us too, because something that you say to a legislator, for example, is like, bilingualism is good for the economy. That bilingual students become great employees, great bosses, and things like that. Many of our families would say, we don't care. Like, we envision something beyond just a bilingual employee for our children. We see cultural roots. We see connections to their grandmothers. We see students who have stronger roots are more likely to stay out of trouble. Those are the kinds of things that they were telling us. That's why they didn't want schools sort of ironing the bilingualism out of their students, but rather encouraging students to bring those skills and that language and that cultural competency to the classroom, because they knew all of these other benefits that were much more important to them than just a bilingual employee, right? And so those were the kinds of things that were reorienting for us, and how we even thought about the arguments that we made to legislators about why it's important for students to be bilingual and why it's important that other people recognize that as an asset. So this change to emergent bilingual will hopefully be followed up with a campaign from TEA, from families, because families are themselves told us that many other families don't understand even why it's so important for their students to be bilingual. They still have these myths as beliefs that teaching your children Spanish and English at home will confuse them, or will delay their learning, or will delay their ability to assimilate into US culture. And so we want to make sure that we are, from even families and community members, all the way to administrators, all the way to school leaders and legislators, changing what we believe that emergent bilingual students are capable of, because we know that that feeds into some of the implicit biases that these people have about what those students are capable of. And that leads to missed opportunities for these students, because you're not going to offer that student AP classes. And so something, I recently was talking to someone and they described it as sort of like the pobrecito syndrome. And I thought that that was a really great way to sort of put it. And pobrecito means like, oh, poor thing, right? And so, and sometimes we see this even from our most well-intentioned school leaders and teachers. They sort of have this like, oh, poor thing sort of mentality and attitude towards students who are learning English in school. And because of that, almost try to shield them from what they believe will be classes that they won't be successful in, such as like rigorous coursework that prepares them for college level work. And the way that we know that this is true is that TEA deems that only 3 in 10 students who graduate from Texas high schools are actually ready for college if they've been labeled emergent bilingual students. So that's huge, right? And so if that's 1 in 5 students, that's 20% of all students. And if we're saying that only 3 in 10 of those students are actually prepared to go and receive postgraduate education, that's a problem for our entire state. And so that's what we wanted our legislators to see. And we hope that by changing this language and changing the perceptions that are associated with these students, that maybe not next legislative session or even the session after that, but after years of using this term to describe students and shifting the perceptions around them, that we'll be able to convince legislators to invest in emergent bilingual students rather than seeing them as sort of like a needy, monolithic, expensive to educate group. They'll see them as a necessary asset to our state, because they are. So these are some just fun screen grabs that I wanted y'all to meet some of our families, even though they couldn't be here with us today. So these are the women who are honestly champions of a lot of the work that we were doing. And we were actually, this top left screenshot on Zoom is a photo that's recent. It was during a legislative debrief session where we were actually able to be joined by a Latino senator named Senator Menendez, who actually met with our families and thanked them for their work in Spanish. And so many of the ladies felt just reinvigorated by hearing from him, tell them how important their work was. And for him to be able to say that to them in Spanish, they said, this is what we see for our students, right? We don't see them just as someone who's going to be earning $1 more in their job because they can answer the phone in Spanish too. We want to see our students doing what this senator is doing, communicating with the community in the language that they understand, and being able to connect with people and being proud of his cultural roots and heritage. That's what we want for our students. And so it was a really powerful and impactful moment for them, as it was for me. As I try not to, some of you might hear the emotion in my voice. We worked with these families for almost a year, and I'm sure that their advocacy will continue. But yeah, thank you so much. If you want to stay in touch with the work that we're doing, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IDRA EDU, and on Twitter, the Education Policy Fellows have an extra Twitter handle where you might find more memes than on the regular IDRA handle. It's IDRA EDU Fellows. And so now I really want to open it up to any questions. I'll bring it back to these photos about any of the bills that I talked about, or any of the communication strategies, any sort of thing. If you are having a problem reaching families, would love to know about that and strategize together. Any questions you may have. It's also not a big deal if y'all don't have questions. This is just a model that IDRA has been working on and that we hope to continue building on in future legislative sessions to come, and having them also advocate with their respective local level decision makers, such as school boards. We don't have to wait for someone at the state level to say that they want social studies, that they want more ethnic studies classes. That's something that people can already push for in their own local communities. Cool, I see some questions in the chat. Diana, I don't know if you can unmute, but if you can type your question regarding SB 2066 in the chat, I'd love to hear it. Saida, they were all female caregivers, which that's why I often refer to them as ladies or moms. But yeah, we didn't have any men join us. I think in my own personal life, my mom was always the one who was involved in school things. I would love to see that change, of course, but that's who would show up. And I think many of us can relate to just our moms being the ones who are there. Sam, how do we reach out to families? So this was important for us because IDRA recognizes that we're not necessarily a direct services organization in the same sense that some of these other grassroots organizations are. And so we really were able to leverage connections that we had with community-based organizations, but also IDRA hired me on as an education policy fellow, and I'm from the sorts of communities that we were talking with. And so I was also able to reach out to some families who were my mom's friends that I had known my entire life, who had little kids who were emergent bilinguals, right? And so I was able to have even a couple of my mom's friends, comadres, we call them, actually join in this advocacy work. And I think that that's the important part. If you're working in a nonprofit, or if you're looking to hire someone at your school who's a liaison with the families that you're trying to reach, that might look like hiring someone like my mom, who doesn't have a college degree necessarily, but who's bilingual and who has those connections with the families, who will know where to meet them. My mom often said, if it didn't happen at my kids' school, at my job, or at the HEB, which is the grocery store here in Texas, then I didn't know about it, right? And so when we talk about, she was not in the activist world, so she doesn't know about meeting people where they're at, but that's what she's talking about. She does know about that. So when we think about how to engage families, how to reach families, we need to go to where families are. And that's their school, their job, and the grocery store if we have to. But those were sort of the kinds of approaches that I took as I was looking for families to join this, who I could personally reach out to. It was families like that. And that's how I reached out to them, at dinner with them. Sometimes I even felt a little weird. We're breaking bread together, but also I'm inviting them to this meeting. And they were more than excited to join. And I'll add a note on that. And I see the other questions here in the chat. But at the end of this, we were actually able to provide about 14 moms with a gift card for their participation. And so we weren't able to offer that in the beginning, but I think it's okay to offer that in the beginning. These women are experts in their experiences. They're taking the time to attend these meetings, to make these phone calls, and we know that that's not easy. Many of these women were also low income, and we knew that if we were able to thank them for their participation, we absolutely wanted to do that. And so that's really important for us as well. What are the implications to LEAs in regards to the use of documents from the state and federal documents since the term is not adopted at the federal level? So what we did in SB 26 was actually go through in state law, and anywhere that limited English proficient or English learner were used, we simply striked that language and replaced it with emergent bilingual. So the definition of who these students are stayed the same. Some of the partners that we worked with were also attorneys, and we were concerned about the same things. We didn't want this to inadvertently hurt students that we were trying to help by then making them ineligible for certain federal funds that are like noted for English learner students or limited English proficient students. We wanted to make sure that the definition of who these students would stay the same. So that's how we sort of got around that. In addition, we had some people who were really friendly at the Texas Education Agency who were willing to make it work, because what we also didn't want, and think this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but we didn't want on the reporting end, because technically a student who is in a dual language immersion program who may be speaking already an English speaker and learning another language through dual language immersion, they might also be considered an emergent bilingual student, right? Because they are emerging in their bilingualism. But what we wanted to do was make sure that on the reporting end, that when we're getting data about these students and what they've been able to achieve and tracking students, that we are still receiving accurate data. And so the TEA said, we believe in this. We want students to be able to see themselves reflected in asset-based language and make this change. So we are going to handle that on the back end and separate out that information accordingly. And they were actually hoping at the TEA that since we had a federal change in presidential administration, that change might come about federally to adopt emergent bilingual, like you said. I haven't heard any conversations about that, but I have heard, and as we're talking with other education advocates in other states, many people are beginning to have this conversation much more seriously. And Texas is the first state to transition to the term emergent bilingual as a state. And I hope to see sort of a ripple effect in other state legislatures. IDRA is planning on leading model legislation and some tips for how we were able to make that change, so that we'll be able to give it to other states who are looking to make that change as well. If it's not going to come down federally, that way at least states are able to make that change. Gina, Miami, Florida, question again about SB 560, a little more information. So you can expand, Gina, if you wanted a little more information, but SB 560 is this statewide strategic plan for bilingual education. It sort of mimics, in Texas, there's a 60 by 30 plan related to higher education. And so this plan essentially is similar. It sets goals. It doesn't necessarily say if the state of Texas doesn't reach the goal outlined by this plan, then something bad happens. It doesn't say that. It doesn't go that far, but it gives us something. It gives us a measuring stick, right? Which is important because we didn't even have that. And so that's what Texas 60 by 30 plan does for higher education. It says by the year 2030, we want 60% of essentially young adults to have at least a 4-year degree. And so what our plan says, or will say, once key stakeholders and teachers and everyone who is mandated to be included in this conversation around a statewide strategic plan is advised, once they put it out, it will set those same kind of benchmarks that will allow us to go back to the legislature and say, this is the statewide plan that we all agreed to. This is what all the key stakeholders had to say, and we missed the goal. So what are we going to do to be able to meet that goal that everybody agrees on? And that might take funding. And so it's sort of like all of these things are the long game, unfortunately. And I appreciate what everyone had to say about baby steps earlier. I completely agree. I hate baby steps. Unfortunately, in Texas, we sort of have to balance those things, right? Especially at the legislative level, when we have to first push for a plan that doesn't have teeth. And then once we know that they're probably going to fail at the goals that are stated in that plan, then be able to push them a little further and say, you need to allocate some funds, or you need to set up a task force that's, tasked with making sure that those things are actually implemented and put into place. So it definitely is a long game. Many people call implementation work the unsexy work of the legislature. But that's the most important work, right? Because without proper implementation of all of these things, it'll just be a maintenance of the status quo, and that's not what we want. So yeah, those are really excellent questions. Please let me know if you have any follow-up questions. You can always reach out to us. That you'll have all our presenter information and the recorded slides and everything. So please feel free to reach out to us. Follow us on Twitter for the latest and greatest coming out of IDRA and from the fellows as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have until 11:50, so if anyone has any questions, I'll be around until then. But if not, thank you so much for joining this session.